Welcome to rabble.ca's webinar. This is a series of webinars that we've been holding, and I'm very delighted today to be hosting the webinar. My name is Libby Davies, and I'm in Vancouver, and I'm delighted to be joined now, as I can see lined up on the screen, and I'll introduce folks in order. David Macdonald, who is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today. Leah Gazan, who is the Member of Parliament from Winnipeg Centre, and Karl Nerenberg, who is the parliamentary reporter for rabble.ca. We certainly welcome folks across the country who are joining this webinar. We're going to have a very interesting discussion. And the focus of today's discussion is really, of course, about the pandemic and COVID-19, but we want to really dive into what's beyond that. First of all, we're going to spend a little bit of time having a discussion about what has been announced in Ottawa, what measures there are. Are they meeting the need that we know is urgent in so many different communities, so many different populations, particularly populations that are vulnerable and at risk? Workers. Then we're also going to talk a little bit about what does the future look like? What are the things that as progressive people that we need to be aware of that are changing in the world, as well as here in Canada. So what does the future look like to us? And then finally, we're going to maybe have a couple of personal observations. We've structured these webinars so that we have a short discussion, about 30 minutes. And then we also have an opportunity to have discussion back and forth with questions from people who are participating. So we will certainly be reserving time for that, because we do want to hear what folks have to say and to have people respond. We have over 300 people who have registered for the webinar, so we hope that people will be joining us. So I'm just going to dive right in and begin by, I guess, putting out there to David and Leah and Karl, your thoughts about what has taken place in Ottawa. We saw the special parliamentary session again on Saturday. We saw the $73 billion wage subsidy that was passed with all-party agreement. So I guess the question is, do we have enough at this point? And really, what are the gaps that are still not yet addressed? And maybe, Karl, you would start us off, because we know you've been writing quite a few columns for Rabble. In fact, one just recently, I think it was today. So what are your thoughts about how things are going in terms of Canada's response?
Well, I just have to say that, we in Canada can never consider our own situation in isolation. We're so close to the Americans. We get all the American media. CBC News World will often break out of its own broadcasting schedule to live broadcast the American president talking. I don't know what other country does that. So although actually BBC often does that too. So that if we were to look at Canada in and of itself, there's still, I'm sure, lots of people in need. We have not really adequately, I don't think, addressed what might happen to Indigenous communities. There's all kinds of talk, and there's money, and there's controlling people coming and going, and we are fortunate so far that and maybe it'll never happen, that this particular contagion never got to an Indigenous community. But so that's one, and of course the situation of homeless people and people who are living in all kinds of marginal situations. It's one thing to tell people to isolate or to stay away from people. Yeah. If you're living 10 people to a small apartment or flat, it's very difficult to do that. And same with the schooling situation, which is outside of Ottawa's purview. But, my granddaughter is so happy that she can get back to school and join her teacher and talk to the other children for an hour or two a day. And she feels so good about that. But she mentioned that there's a friend of hers where there are 7 children vying for the same computer. That's a very different situation. And some people don't have computers. I used to spend a lot of time when I didn't have a functioning computer in the public library, using the computer there. Well, the libraries are closed. So that's all one aspect. But when I do look at us big picture, our governments, federal and provincial and municipal, I guess, compared to our nearest neighbor, I have to say I feel relieved. I mean, what's happening south of the border is literal insanity. I mean, they have a literally mentally ill person as the president,
Yeah.
and
Well, I think
they're yelling at each other. They're calling each other names. We don't, except for Jason Kenney, getting off the script for one minute. Even Doug Ford has shown himself. Actually, he is a real human being. I was a little bit surprised, but I'll give him credit. I will give him credit. He is an actual normal human being who has normal, empathetic human reactions. He has a mother and he has fellow human beings and he recognizes they exist and he cares about them. Well, we don't get that with South.
Karl, I'm going to bring in David and Leah here. Now, David, you wrote a really great report through the CCPA called the Canadian COVID-19, the Canadian Workforce, and you really kind of put up the red flags and hit the areas where workers are vulnerable. Now, we know that some of the measures that were brought in on Saturday have addressed some of those areas. And I would say, actually, thanks to the NDP, Leah, who I know moved an amendment and got the motion amended to include some of, seasonal workers, students, people who have run out of EI or didn't qualify for EI. But David, what are your thoughts in terms of, is there still a gap between what's been announced? And of course, it sounds like a huge amount of money to all of us, but what actually will be delivered in terms of real support for people who are in very dire straits?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the emergency benefit is the main program for workers, and it's a good program. I mean, given that they wrote it in a week and a half, it's a miraculous program. Frankly, the money's already going out the door, and people are gaining access to it quickly. Mm-hmm. It's a good program. That's not to say that it covers everybody. And since I've been working on this analysis, there has slowly been increases in the coverage of who gets the emergency benefit and who doesn't, in large part due to people in the House pushing for it, and hats off to the NDP in particular for pushing for it. The main category of people that I was concerned with that are unemployed but will receive no support either from employment insurance or from the new emergency benefit are those that became unemployed prior to March 15th. Now, if you're unemployed prior to March 15th, you don't get access to the emergency benefit, and you are beholden to the old EI rules that we've thrown out for everybody else, but they still apply to you because you were unemployed prior to March 15th. Now, one of those groups, those for whom their claim has run out, and that's why they're not getting any EI, looks like they will be scooped up in this latest change. And so that's about 55,000 people who prior to Saturday wouldn't have gotten support and now appear that they will get support. But there still remains a group of people that don't have enough hours to qualify for, or didn't have enough hours to qualify for EI, or didn't work recently. So they just came back from maternity leave, for instance, and they entered the job market and they couldn't find a job right away. And then COVID-19 hit. In that case, they don't get the emergency benefit. They can't get EI because they didn't have enough hours. It didn't work. And so there's still about it's about 550,000 Canadians who are unemployed but can't get EI and they can't get the emergency benefit.
Yeah.
Now, the emergency benefit covers a lot more people than were ever covered by EI. It covers self-employed people. It doesn't worry about the number of hours that you've worked and so on. So it's much easier to access. But one of its main impediments is a $5,000 threshold in earnings that you need to have made in the previous 12 months or in 2019 in order to access the emergency benefit. And you might think, well, $5,000 over the course of a year, that's not really very much. But if you look at the industries that were hit hardest by this, retail, food, hospitality, arts, culture, sports, these are all very seasonal industries. A lot of part-time work, a lot of students, a lot of young people that come in for certain periods of the year and then go out. And so there's about 200,000 people who aren't going to gain access to the emergency benefit despite having a job and despite being laid off due to COVID-19 because they didn't make enough money in the previous year. And so the other big piece that I think is worthwhile pointing out is that social assistance recipients, for the most part, except in British Columbia, will have the CERB benefit, the emergency benefit, clawed back at 100% against their social assistance. So they could apply and get the emergency benefit if they wanted to, but then they would see their social assistance cut back by the exact same amount. Mm-hmm. This is, of course, provincial jurisdiction, and the federal government, though, until a day or two ago, had not been clear on what it wanted the provinces to do. But now the federal government has said that they would not like to see that emergency benefit money clawed back against social assistance, and so it is now in the province's court in essence as to what they want to do about it.
No, I think that does bring us to the point, because you're showing us very well how many people are still left out when they're in need. And I know, Leah, that the NDP has been advocating and pushing very hard for your leader, Jagmeet Singh, for really what's a universal benefit, i.e. get money to everybody, send everybody a check, $2,000 a month, and then claw it back as needed through the income tax system. What did that get much debate in Parliament? What do you think is the likelihood of it, of us possibly moving to that level as the picture becomes clearer and the Liberal government gets pushed on this?
Well, certainly we keep pushing for a universal benefit. I think what we're realizing through COVID-19 is we cannot go back to the way things were. And what I've said is, it's not that we wouldn't have a pandemic, but the reason we're having a crisis is because in this country, not everybody is afforded human rights. Particularly, you were talking, Libby, and I really appreciated your comments, Karl. For example, in my riding, I have 3 shelters just within blocks of where I live. And, they don't benefit from the programs of the government that are coming out. And although there was $15 million that was put aside for urban Indigenous strategies around COVID for the whole country, one of my staffers actually did some math around it this evening, and she said it's only $17 a person.
Yeah.
So a lot of the funding that's come out is just grossly inadequate and doesn't reach the most vulnerable populations. And I think if we're going to get through this pandemic, one thing we know is the only way we can do that is if everybody is looked after. This pandemic does not discriminate, and I've said that. If we don't look after people in shelters, if we don't look after and provide human rights, for example, to people in Indigenous communities who continue to be grossly underfunded, it will impact the health of all Canadians. And so how we care for each other will determine how we get through this quickly and how we will be able to deal with pandemics going forward to make sure that everybody has their basic necessities met. And just going back to what Karl's saying, I know that we have a limited time. I've said many times, social isolation is a privileged activity. You need a home, you need your own toilet. Leilani Farha, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, has been very clear. There's a number of hotels and buildings that are vacant. We could be using to ensure that people that are currently living in the homeless community are safe by allowing them to stay in hotels and be provided with proper shelter right now to make sure they're safe. That is a choice. And I'm hoping that, in addition to getting extra money to be able to afford people with human rights, certainly the government always seems to find money to, provide fossil fuel subsidies for big oil. Certainly, if the government can reach in their pockets, we can ensure people are safe. So I think it's a choice. Certainly, I'm glad with some of the changes that were made on Saturday. It's still not far enough.
Yeah, I know certainly in Vancouver there's been a big call from our mayor, Kennedy Stewart, for the federal government and the provincial government to address issues around homelessness and people who are on the street. And people are very, very worried about, for example, the situation in the downtown east side, not to even mention the predicament that our cities are facing. I mean, they're even talking about bankruptcy. But what I want to come back to is, I do think that, everybody's focused on the day by day and getting through day by day, but I know everybody is thinking about, well, what about the future? What does happen in the future? And Karl, in one of your columns, a recent one, you talked about, on the one hand, we can be very hopeful about this pandemic has made us more collectivist. It's made people think about sharing, and there are some just wonderful stories out there of what local communities are doing virtually and how people are helping each other. But there's also a dark side to it in terms of, the corporate elites and how they will use this in a way to create an economic system that exacerbates even more the inequalities in our society. So I wonder if we could spend just a couple minutes on that in terms of what you folks are thinking about. Leah, for you in a parliamentary sense, in terms of Canada, David, economically, maybe we start with you. I mean, what should we be thinking of? What should we be looking to and keeping our eye on as we look at sort of a future economically and socially and even politically, and to be aware of things that could change very drastically, either for good or for bad.
I mean, I really think that until we get a health solution in some sense to COVID-19, I think in general, Canada seems to be doing well at crushing the curve, as it were. But this is only temporary. I mean, once the social lockdown is lifted, we'll see infections rise again, and we'll have to do the lockdown again. And until we have an effective treatment, or until we have a vaccine for COVID-19, I think that the frontline workers that got hammered this time will continue to be without work, or continue to be substantially underemployed for a long time to come. I mean, even if we were to say everyone can go out to restaurants and you can go to the mall and shop tomorrow, I think that people would be pretty leery to, and justifiably so. I mean, you've got this very dangerous disease that could harm you, could harm your relatives, your children. And so I think for the time being, we need to continue to build on the programs that we've got and improve them as time goes on. But I don't think that we have a full scale yet of what has happened to the economy. We've seen 1 million people lose their jobs. Another 2 million people had the majority of their hours cut. 3 million Canadians. We have 1 out of every 4 working age Canadians is receiving the emergency benefit. I mean, this is just a shocking ratio, even if there is some duplicate there. I mean, we talk about a basic income. Whether we like it or not, the emergency benefit is becoming a basic income. I mean, there is no real requirement except that you check a box off. I mean, there are requirements, obviously, but they aren't being evaluated immediately. And so I think that that's a good foundation. I think that we'll realize we need to continue to liberalize that system such that more people can gain access.
Yeah, I know that. I was going to say, one of your colleagues, Jim Stanford, also an economist, he just wrote an article saying we're going to need a Marshall Plan, which of course is the plan that came after the Second World War. That was a public-led reconstruction plan. Is that what you foresee in terms of what we'll need to do in Canada and even globally? And how do we advance that in the face of what's going to be probably a very aggressive move by corporations and the WTO, the IMF? Karl, you mentioned the guy, the president of the World Bank. Some terrible quotes from him about what he's going to be calling for. So I mean, it's going to be pretty aggressive out there. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think once the full scale of what's happened in Canada, what's happened in the US in terms of damage to the economy from COVID-19 is realized, it won't be. I mean, we think that this is going to be a V recession. Everyone's going to go back to work a week from now or 2 weeks from now, and everything will return to normal. I just don't think that's what's going to happen. I think that this type of massive impact on the labor market is not something that goes away, and is not really something that can be restarted by the private sector. So it's not that people are just going to go back to their jobs and the restaurants are going to fill up and the retail chains are going to fill up and people will go shopping. I think that as the longer this drags on, the harder it will be to reopen those businesses, and more of them that will go bankrupt, frankly, and that will never reopen. And so what, again, as we saw in terms of just supporting the basic needs of Canadians, we turn to government. I mean, we don't turn to industry. They can't help us, right? The private sector can't help us. We have to turn to provincial and federal governments. And they've actually shown themselves, quite willing to throw away systems like EI, throw it all in the bin in a week and a half and completely replace it with what's frankly a better system, much faster, much more modern, covers a lot more people.
Yeah.
And so hopefully, one of the things that we'll get out of this is we'll leave EI where it belongs, which is in the garbage, and we'll use the emergency benefit as a foundation for a better, higher standard system. And I think that, in terms of driving growth going forward, there will certainly be the calls to austerity. I think that health budgets will certainly be maintained. But then, provincial and federal governments will say, geez, we spent all this money. We're going to have to cut back education. Now everyone's going to have to pay, $20,000 for tuition. And, we're going to transfer less to schools and childcare, and you'll have to pay more for those. And so while there are some good things like the restructuring of and the wholesale abandonment of the old EI system, there will almost certainly be hard fought battles against coming austerity.
Yeah, I sure like that Jagmeet Singh has been saying we can't go back to the old normal. Old normal was no good. Too many people were left behind. Karl, you quoted this guy from the World Bank, and it was kind of an alarming quote. How are you seeing the future in terms of what might unfold and the opportunities for progressives to put forward a progressive view of economic restructuring and what we're up against from the corporate sector in that regard?
So I think David put it very well. He said that when we start getting more or less back to normal, governments that are essentially market economy based governments that at heart their political ideology or philosophy or outlook is based on encouraging business and on government staying more or less out of the way and allowing space for business as their basic operating philosophy. And of course, we have all different kinds of governments who are behaving quite similarly right now, regardless of their differing ideologies. But those governments are going to start looking at the main issue being debt and deficit, just as we had this huge mania about that going way back in the 1990s and even earlier. And we're spending money madly right now, and they're going to say, okay, we're already seeing this. You're already seeing some talk about that. You're seeing columns, and you're seeing journalists and columns and say, oh my God, all this debt we're accumulating. Even before any of this happened, Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives will talk a lot about that. Oh, there's running up way too much debt. And so you start focusing on that narrowly. If we go back to the Great Depression, the 1930s, that was the reaction of some governments. You had a situation where the economy, the bottom had fallen out of the economy, unemployment was heading towards 20 to 30% of the population, nothing was moving, nothing was working, and their solution was like to pour oil on the fire and make it worse, was to, we have to balance our budgets. We have to have fiscal discipline. And that's what this guy from the World Bank was. He's talking about his clientele, which is the developing world, for the World Bank. But the IMF probably thinks the same for countries like Canada. And he's saying, well, what we're going to have to do now is tell these people they're going to have to get out of debt, and they're going to have to use this code word, structural adjustment. That means take things away from ordinary people. That means impoverish somebody. Structural adjustment means balance the budget at all costs. And of course, these are countries that have many, many fewer resources and many much less to fall back on than does Canada, and they're going to squeeze them. And so I think that we're going to have this. I think the argument maybe progressives had to start thinking about is to say, really have to rebalance the things. If we look back at, and David can talk about this better than I can, look back at taxation. I was just explaining this to somebody today. In the 1950s and 60s, the highest marginal tax rate in countries like ours and the United States was way over 50%. In other words, the income that the highest portion of somebody's income, say over $400,000 or $500,000 or even $200,000, was more than half of it was taxed back. This was considered to be, since the election really of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, untenable. And we had a huge sea change in the way we think of the economy and the way we think of a public good, essentially since the advent, even earlier than Margaret Thatcher, but really when Margaret Thatcher came in Britain, then Ronald Reagan in the United States, and had a huge impact. And we had a liberal government in the 1990s in Canada that essentially adopted that same.
Well, it sounds like, and I would certainly agree with this, that the debate and the struggle is going to become even sharper than it was before in terms of, where does the global economy go? What happens in Canada? What would happen certainly in the US? I mean, on the positive side, I think, well, God, hopefully more people in the US will begin to understand that having a functioning public healthcare, single-payer healthcare system is essential. But of course, one never knows how people respond to these things. We do have some questions coming in. Actually, one, Leah, directly about Manitoba. asking what your take is on the Manitoba government's actions in the last few days, where they're threatening to have civil servants go to work for 2 days a week and taking away funds for non-essential organizations. The person saying, how could we fight this? So that's something in Manitoba.
Yeah, and it's not just non-essential organizations, it's also not-for-profit. So I know we're talking about future austerity, yet in the middle of a pandemic. The Manitoba government is meeting today in the legislative building, talking about cutbacks. And I think that's abhorrent. And right now I'm fighting for small and medium-sized businesses in my community with no help from the provincial government. The first question when I'm asking for funding from the feds is, where's the province at? Well, I know where the province of Manitoba is at, and it is hurting, people on the ground because they seem to consistently be unwilling to cooperate with either the municipal government or the federal government, even in terms of housing programs. Now we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have a growing housing crisis. And I think, I've talked about in other episodes about the importance of people power and the importance of people. We have to remember we are the electorate. We are the ones that vote either people in or out. And I think right now it's critical for people to voice their opposition to these cutbacks. I know many not-for-profits, leader of not-for-profits right now who are panicked with the provincial cutbacks. They're already hurting. We've had austerity since Palliser's gotten in, and we're worried it's just going to get worse.
Yeah. Well, here's a question that's come in from someone that I think really sort of hits it right on in terms of, with this pandemic, how do we make sure that big issues aren't just being cast aside or swept under the rug? And the person is saying, prior to the pandemic, our attention, and I think they probably mean the progressive activist community, was on First Nations, particularly the Wet'suwet'en. And it looked like that after all of that enormous public pressure, the roadblocks, the activism, that finally Canada might sit down and truly think about and accommodate demands and finally treat First Nations with respect. So question, is the government carrying through on that? Do we know anything? Or was there all that work for naught? And I think you could mirror that with any number of other issues around the climate crisis, any number of things. Like how do we keep that activism focused in terms of all of these issues that we know are so important? Leah, why don't you respond to that quickly, and then we'll go to Karl and David.
Yeah, so I don't think any sort of movement, any sort of is ever for naught. But I can say one of the things that I have been consistently speaking about is in the middle of the pandemic, we see a continuation of Coastal GasLink and LNG. Knowing that in terms of workers and bringing workers inside and out Wet'suwet'en territory is certainly not following Health Canada guidelines. And I think, just because we're in a pandemic, there's other ways to voice your opinions. We have social media. There's many people across the country are meeting online like we're doing tonight through Zoom. And I think we have to keep that pressure going. And I think things like the climate emergency haven't ended since the pandemic. And it's important to continue to highlight these issues. I mean, now we see the oil industry tanking. The price of oil is imploding. And we see that happening before our eyes. Now's the time we can talk about innovative solutions, like switching to a green economy in a way that brings workers along. And if there are bailouts, let's not bail out corporations. Let's bail out workers and provide them a way to move into a new economy that puts workers first. So I think, like we see in Manitoba, we need to fight hard right now for just basic services. We've seen grotesque cutbacks in healthcare. For example, we are feeling the impacts right now. We have seen cutbacks in all areas, and now a premier that's talking about cutting back on essential services that will mean the life and death for many people, certainly in my riding. So I don't think now is a time for pause. I think actually now is an opportunity where we can make changes that are lasting. We cannot go back to the way things have been. It clearly does not work for people. And if it's anything that we've witnessed in the pandemic, it's how well it is not working for people. And I agree with you, David, like the EI system is archaic. It's ineffective and archaic. And if they can come up with a solution, if people are getting money in 5 days, in a short period of time, certainly it's a choice about how we wish to move forward. I really am hoping for a universal annual guaranteed, I've been talking about a livable income. And in terms of matters of human rights, we still have human rights violations going on before our eyes. Certainly we see with the homeless community that happening in real time, issues in First Nations in terms of not getting proper support happening in real time. We need to speak louder than ever before. It's a life and death matter. So I encourage people to keep fighting for what is right.
David, one question that's come in, how can Ottawa effectively deal with Alberta and help transform the economy of dirty oil to a greener, renewable energy sources that employs oil workers? So again, one of these big questions of, is there an opportunity here for a shift? Can we make some headway in terms of the Alberta government? Will public sentiment there change in terms of realizing that, you know, the fossil fuel days are limited, they're gone, and we need to have a new kind of economy? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, $20 a barrel oil puts a lot of the oil sands into uneconomic production. So it's not even so much that we need to make policy decisions. The market has already decided that the oil in Alberta is just far too expensive. And as a result, Alberta going into this was in much worse straits. Calgary and Edmonton had much higher unemployment rates going into this, as did the province itself, compared to other big cities and other big provinces where unemployment was actually very low in February coming into this crisis. And so I think that what that means, there's a lot more people that are unemployed in Alberta, not only because of the shutdown of retail, food, hospitality, arts, sports, culture, but also because of the impact that this is going to have on the oil sands. Now, a lot of the investment that was happening in Alberta dried up about 4 years ago when we saw a big crash in oil, and much of it hasn't come back. And that's actually where a lot of the jobs are. It's not necessarily in the ongoing withdrawal of tar sands, but it's a construction of the mines in the first place where you get a lot of the employment. And so with that being said, I think that the opportunity here is we need another option for folks. And this is what just transition is about. You can't just say, you know, we don't like the oil sands, all you people are fired, you know, you're all laid off. That's a terrible plan. We have a runway here that we need to get to net zero emissions by 2040, 2050 in Canada. That runway potentially got, threw a lot more people out of the plane, not because of government policy, but because of the way the market has reacted to this. Governments need to step in now and say, look, there is other employment for people. You don't have to work in the oil sands to make a good salary. You can make a good salary doing something else in Alberta. Yeah. And so now is the opportunity for just transition, I think. Unfortunately, a lot of those plans haven't really been developed. I mean, they were in development. And there's a decent strategy for just transition for coal workers, for coal miners, but less so for oil sands workers. So it is unfortunate that those plans are not up and running. I mean, we've certainly been working hard at the CCPA on something that starts to look like that, but the market has decided for us, in essence, that these workers shouldn't be employed, unfortunately.
Yeah, Karl, very curious about the political discourse that's been changing as well. Thus far in Canada, we've seen things that have been fairly nonpartisan, the parties working together quite effectively. I don't know how long that will hold up. We certainly need to have parliamentary oversight and accountability for any regulatory legislative changes. So that's very important. But I'm just curious, because you watch Ottawa very closely, you're kind of like our eyes and ears on Ottawa, whether or not you see any more far-reaching changes in terms of political discourse in this country because of the pandemic, maybe different kinds of expectations from elected representatives and how we expect them to work?
So first, on a small scale, maybe the voters will get used to. I mean, I think what the opposition in Canada, and I think I'm not trying to just say the NDP because we have people associated with the NDP here, but objectively speaking, to a significant extent, the NDP as a party in Parliament has adopted Jack Layton's philosophy. You're providing proposition, not opposition.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to say what's going on. I mean, it was very impressive when Jagmeet Singh had many positive things to say about the Prime Minister and expressed empathy for him in a situation when his wife was herself sick, and said he wasn't like trying to take any shots. He wasn't like personalizing anything. And even, quite frankly, even Andrew Scheer resisted it, though it's not necessarily in his nature to resist it. So, and so you have this notion that we really have a goal and that we all have to be working on practical and pragmatic solutions because we have such a huge, it is kind of a wartime situation. We have such a huge challenge that we all recognize. Fortunately, we all recognize it. Again, looking south of the border, this doesn't happen there. So we actually had demonstrations in Michigan with people turning up and saying, we want to abandon all these measures because we're Christians and we believe in God and God will take care of us, and don't tell us what to do. Don't let scientists and doctors get in the way and tell us what to do. We don't have these people. That segment of the population in Canada is tiny compared to the United States, where it's like tens of millions of people who believe that. There's very few of those people in Canada so far. Maybe they'll all turn up tomorrow. So, I mean, we feared it once when Harper was in power. But then the bigger issue is the paradigm shift I'm thinking about is that we have to, that once we start looking to the other side of this, you want to get over the idea that even progressives have been forced to acquiesce in for the last 40 or 50 years, that the productive economy is the private sector. I mean, the tendency in Canada has been to shed the public sector and grow the private sector. I mean, I remember way back when we had a national airline that was owned by the federal government. You know, we owned the federal government was considered to be capable of doing all kinds of things. And the idea was, oh, it's much better if it's privatized. Even a little thing, we have a national park here, Gatineau Park, near Ottawa. They used to have officials and park rangers and people who worked for the government, worked for the park, who were in charge of taking care of the place. Then an economist and senior official of the government told me, oh, well, we're privatizing that because the new economic theory is that if we have a company that has to make a profit that stands between the public and the service, that somehow is better. You know, somehow, I mean, we have food in prisons is now provided by private companies, have to make a profit out of it. And nobody says, yeah, but the profit's part of the, if you have to have a profit for somebody in here, that's taking away from the service. Now we're realizing that. Now we see nursing homes, and Rebel's done a huge amount of work on nursing homes over the last couple of years, and we should thank our former labor reporter, Zayden Nusmar, who did wonderful, excellent work. People are saying, no, it's ridiculous to introduce the element of profit into the provision of the service. It's ridiculous. We have to go further and say that if you're talking about the green economy, you have to say we can't simply count on the private sector just to take incentives and somehow do it. What we have to say is we can do it. We can make things. We can build things by our collective. Something that's built by public dollars is no less worthy than something that's built by the private sector because somebody will make a profit from it. So, I mean, you know, but that will require a different attitude towards the tax system, and we have to look differently at how we're going to be taxing.
And of course,
high income. Sorry,
yeah,
I'm carrying on too much here.
Yeah, and of course, we don't know how long that can be sustained, right? I mean, I think now people are in a frame of mind where they're thinking about these questions and realizing the value of public services and public and infrastructure, and looking after precarious workers. I mean, just think of the Amazon workers who were, you know, sort of in effect out on strike a couple of weeks ago in the US. So things have changed very dramatically. But I think one of the big questions is how do we sustain that in terms of people imagining and realizing that there are economic, political, and social other possibilities that are real, they're attainable, and that, you know, we're going to be facing this struggle as the World Banks and the IMFs and the World Trade Organizations and all the rest of them, you know, race to take us in another direction. So I guess it's sort of the big question that is looming ahead for all of us. We have a few minutes left. We had actually quite a lot of questions about people's concerns about home care, long-term care, just what you were mentioning, Karl, about how privatization and lack of regulation has now placed older people at such risk in these facilities, and we're seeing so many of the deaths associated with that. So we didn't really have time to get into that. But just to kind of begin to get to the end of our discussion here, we've got a few minutes late, and I want to really thank the hundreds of people who registered to be part of the discussion today, and people shared so many questions. Just if you have any personal thoughts about what you see in, say, towards the end of the year, are you feeling a sense of renewed activism, a sense of optimism, or are you feeling that it's going to be a really tough time ahead? Any one of you would like to pick that up?
Well, I think it's both, Libby's. I don't think that we can go back to the way things were. I know we can't. They're talking about this being the first of potentially 3 waves to come. And I don't think we have an option but to look for a new way forward. And as difficult as this time is, I hear discussions happening in this country that I've never heard about. Certainly, I'm feeling more hopeful, and I'm hoping that this current government does the right thing and puts in place a universal guaranteed annual livable income for all people. I certainly think that would be of great assistance to seniors and families and all people in this country, and I feel hopeful at that. I also think that we're having discussions about moving towards a just transition, just looking at the way the economy is going. And we have an opportunity here to be courageous. And we have an opportunity here to address issues in our world that have been ignored. And I'm talking about human rights and what it looks like right now in the midst of a pandemic, because not everybody is afforded with human rights. And I think it's become glaring. I think that there's been more attention than ever on ensuring that all people have minimum human rights, whether they be Indigenous, seniors, newcomers, refugees in our country, and how we want to have good relationships with each other where we respect each other through action, not through words. So I actually feel hopeful. It's not easy being isolated, but at least I have the privilege to do so. But it certainly gives you time to be mindful and to be mindful of each other, whether you're in a grocery store and you have to be mindful of distance. Where you go, you always have to be mindful of others. And I think this pandemic is forcing us to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. And David?
I mean, I look at these unemployment numbers, or the not even unemployment numbers, but the change in employment numbers, and they're just shocking. I mean, the impact on just regular people's lives that have just been turned totally upside down in 2 weeks. 1 in 5 women lost their job in the last 2 weeks. 1 in 4 people in Toronto lost their job or had the majority of their hours cut in the last 4 weeks. A third of everybody making under $14 an hour lost their job in the last 2 weeks or had their hours cut. I mean, the impact of this just on regular people's lives, I think, is not fully understood. And the longer it drags out, the harder it becomes on people just to cover the basics like rent and food, much less saving or anything like that. And I think we need to recognize that these folks are not leaving their jobs because they want to. They're not leaving their jobs because their employers want them to. They want to work. Their employers want them to work. They're doing it to help us stay safe. They're doing it because we can't have them work, because otherwise the spread would be much more severe. And so I always come back to that when I think of, should we be doing these programs? Are these programs necessary? I mean, these are the folks who are sacrificing for the rest of us through losing their jobs. And these income support programs are good. They could be better, but they're certainly not a replacement for a job and for most of these folks. I think every year we do our alternative federal budget, and we say, look, we don't make these decisions. We don't improve the EI system, or we don't improve workers' benefits. It's not an economic choice, it's a political choice. And one of the hopeful things is, of course, it's quite clear that if people put their minds to it, the cupboard is not bare. It is absolutely possible to provide $2,000 a month to everybody who's lost their job if we want to. And so I think that that we don't, the battle for progressives is not to snap back to, oh, the cupboard is bare, we don't have this money. We just illustrated we do have the money, in fact, and we can absolutely do these things. And we need to continue to fight to maintain some of these new things that have been put in place as the austerity bears come out of hibernation, in 6 months' time, when we start to see some end to this crisis.
Well, I guess it takes us back to that age-old question that the pie is still there. It's just the question of how we divide it up and who gets what share. So this really brings it into very, very sharp contrast. And your reports and your numbers really, I think, show people what it is we need to pay attention to. Karl, any final thoughts from you about the political side of things in terms of Ottawa and what we might expect?
Well, I mean, first place, I really appreciate the work that David's doing and appreciate the work that Leah is doing in Parliament. Appreciate the work that you do in Vancouver. But to talk about, and I do very little and try to survive. But I would say that there's still, despite the fact that the government is going deeply into debt to pay for these new programs here in Canada and elsewhere, there's still enormous, vast reservoirs of accumulated untouched wealth here and elsewhere that we had for so long taken the attitude it was hands off all of that. John Kenneth Galbraith wrote quite presciently many, many decades ago to make the rich work harder, we pay them more. To make the poor work harder, we pay them less.
Yeah.
And I think that has really been the dominating governing philosophy of our society, certainly going back to the late 1970s. And I think we want to talk about a root and branch. I mean, even for parties like the NDP, when you go back to the 2015 election campaign, the NDP was not only felt it had to say that it would balance the budget, it was reluctant to say it would raise any individual person's taxes. And I think you have to sort of say now, we're going to have to look at really equalizing things and really rebalancing the economy. And that's more perhaps than merely tinkering at the edge.
Well, in the name of equalization, I'd like to thank each of you equally. David Macdonald, a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Leah Gazan, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, and Karl Nerenberg, parliamentary reporter for rabble.ca, for sharing your thoughts with us. I kind of feel that this webinar, we could call it grassroots critical thinking, because we did get absolutely amazing questions from people. And for the hundreds of people who joined us today, thank you so much. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. They were really great questions. We will be continuing with this series. And for sure, feel free to check in with rabble.ca online. You can always donate. If I could put in a little plug, rabble.ca/donate. It's an independent online media that is sustained by good people across this country. So thank you to the three of you and to all of the folks across the country for joining us today. And I'm sure that we will continue this discussion because, it's the time, it's the big questions of the day and into the future. So thank you very much to all of you.